Hello everyone and welcome at this web lecture in which we will discuss the United Nations. That is, the historical background of the United Nations and the organizational structure of the UN. First of all, it's quite important to understand the predecessor of the United Nations, that is the League of Nations. The League of Nations was there in the interbellum, and we could say at some point that the League of Nations was one of the first attempts to create an international organization in which most of the countries in the world would participate in order to establish peace and security. However, we can also say that the League of Nations utterly failed. The reason for that, well, we can argue about it, but most likely that is because of the one-sided aim of only, establishing less weapons in the world and economically isolating those who lost the First World War. This has led to a deadly cocktail that in the end ultimately was a contributing factor for the Second World War to emerge, unfortunately. Now, after the Second World War, a second attempt was undertaken to unite most countries in the world, if not all the countries in the world. And this was done by establishing the United Nations. In 1944, the UN Charter was signed and ratified by most of its member states, and since then the United Nations came into being. And this is a wonderful symbol of the United Nations, of course. Now, there are several bodies that are quite important for the United Nations, and to understand the functioning of the United Nations, we must also understand the individual roles to play by those UN bodies. The General Assembly is a very large gathering, as you can see here on the picture, in which all countries of the world are represented. Well, almost all countries of the world are represented. And the General Assembly has several jobs, basically. First of all, it's a political body. That means that all countries represented discuss matters of the world, so to say, and if they adopt a regulation, then each country has one vote. Most of the times, however, they try to adopt regulations with unanimous voting. That means that all countries should agree on something. The thing is that the United Nations, as I already said, is highly a political body. That means that they have a very limited legally binding powers. The only legally binding powers they have are mostly internal binding powers. That means that they have to agree on particular budgets and agree on how they work together. But externally, that is legally binding powers towards the world, the power of the General Assembly is rather limited. Therefore, it is considered to be a main political body because in the context of the General Assembly, the world's leaders, they gather, they meet each other. It's actually a large forum for political debate. And in that sense, it's quite an important institution. Another main body is the ECOSOC Council. The Economic and Social Council is there to help the General Assembly in performing its jobs. And the ECOSOC Council, in that sense, is more like a think tank, more like a research council that prepares most of the works of the General Assembly. Not all the countries participate in the ECOSOC Council. They have 54 members who, in a rotation, are represented. And their main goal is to initiate studies to become knowledgeable of certain challenges in the world, and in order to do so they can address the General Assembly by preparing their works for them. So the General Assembly is able to discuss the matters they want to discuss on an informed basis. Another side job of the ECOSOC Council is that they oversee the specialized agencies. And I will discuss the specialized agencies at the end of this lecture. Another main body of the United Nations is the Security Council. They are mostly known for their legislative powers. As a matter of fact, this council can actually bring in the troops when there is an international conflict. There are 15 members, of which 5 members are permanent. These were the so-called victories of the Second World War. And these permanent members, they also have a veto power within the Security Council. These are the United States of America, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom. So that means that if one of these 5 countries does not agree to a particular regulation that will be adopted, then the regulation in itself will never be adopted. This council is responsible for overseeing peace and security in the world, and they have various legal authorities of which they can make use. Amongst them is the imposing of economic sanctions, which is relatively a mild sanction they can impose on countries who are at some point misbehaving in line with international law. But they can also oversee, literally bring in the UN troops if it's needed. However, this barely ever happens because the 5 permanent members, they barely agree on anything. Really sending in the troops is a very rare occasion. Another main body is the Secretariat, and the UN Secretariat is actually the most important managerial body of the United Nations. This is a building from New York, as you can see. And in essence, the Secretariat is politically neutral and represents the United Nations as such. So if at some point aliens will come down to this planet, then it will probably be the UN Secretary General shaking the hands of the aliens, if the aliens have hands in the first place. This is a highly ceremonial function, so there is no real political power, but what we see in practice is the Secretary General will call conflicting parties and advise them to establish peace and to withhold themselves from undertaking violent actions and so forth. Internally, within the United Nations context, this is mostly a managerial post, so that means that buildings, personnel must be financed and must be maintained and so on, which is also one of the responsibilities of the Secretariat. The last main body of the United Nations is the International Court of Justice, situated in The Hague in the Peace Palace, as you can see over here. Originally, the intention was to establish an international court that would be able to rule in disputes between states. So the dispute settlement as such has a certain limitation, because only when state parties are involved in the international legal conflict, the International Court of Justice will be competent. This means that individuals who, for instance, violate international legal rules cannot be tried in front of the court. So if someone commits genocide, which is obviously prohibited in international humanitarian law, that person will not be brought before the International Court of Justice, and instead the United Nations will probably have to establish a separate tribunal to administer justice in those particular cases. There's also another very strong limitation, and it is that states have to consent to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. And a lot of countries, they simply reject the competency of this court. That makes it quite difficult to rule in particular matters. For instance, the United States of America denies the jurisdiction of this court. The United Nations can also establish subsidiary bodies. First of all, they can be installed by the General Assembly, the ECOSOC Council or the Security Council. There are different procedures to that, as you can see in the various articles of the UN Charter. And they can be established in order to help them performing their jobs. A wonderful example is UNICEF, which is a famous body that is involved with trying to contribute to the realization of the rights of the child. And they are established by the ECOSOC Council. Another possibility to cooperate with other institutions is to create a partnership. So these bodies are not a part of the UN family, so to say. They are connected to the United Nations as such, but they act autonomously. They can join a partnership with the United Nations under Article 57 of the United Nations Charter. Famous examples are the Bretton Woods institutions. Among them is the International Monetary Fund. Well, I hope you learned a few things from watching this lecture, and thank you very much for watching, and good luck with studying.